Okay, so it's saying that I'm live right now. I think there'll be a little bit of a delay for it to go onto that screen, but I think people can see me. Hello. If you can't hear me, please drop a message into the live chat box. I should be able to see that. All right, perfect. In that case, let's get this roast a-cooking. Yeah, it'll be delayed by I think a few seconds, but that's perfectly tolerable. Okay, so okay. All right. So hi everybody, and welcome to my live streamed workshop entitled Intersectionalizing Your Debating: How to Debate Well About Social Identities. And hello to everybody who's here. Hi. Everyone else who's here has been here for about an hour before, so I think they're already a bit sick of me. So what this presentation is going to focus on is it's going to focus on how to discuss oppressive constructs within the context of debating. It's going to give you hopefully a bunch of ideas on different things you might want to case file or talk about. So I don't know how many of you have seen Dee Courtney's video, which is how to debate about feminism and social justice. This is intended as a complement to that, so definitely try and watch both. But one of the things she does say, which I agree with, is that a lot of people feel uncomfortable debating about social identities because they don't know where to start essentially reading and researching, or what things they should be reading or researching. The list of those things is huge, but there are going to be within the slides that I'm using a number of examples. And so those slides are going to be available on the training platform and also within the description to this video below. So just make sure you watch it and then take those slides, and hopefully they can provide a starting point for you in order to be able to maybe get started if you're not sure how to debate about these things. Secondly, thank you to everybody who submitted questions on the form that I put out. I think a lot of those questions will be answered during the course of this presentation. So there are a few in question that were, a few in particular that were quite similar. So they often would say things like, how do we deal with people who bring up social justice within debating, or that just throw out social justice arguments, or someone said that they feel they themselves are using the same examples over and over again and it's almost getting a little lazy. Those questions, that's essentially what this entire presentation seeks to do. I did have two particular questions. Those ones I'm going to discuss kind of halfway through the presentation. So if you ask me a question that I didn't just discuss, don't worry, I will get to it. All right, but apart from that, let's get back to this presentation, everyone. So intersectionalizing your debating, how to debate well about social identities. There's actually a bit of an exercise that I want to happen. So the next slide, I want you to pay close attention to it, because I'm only going to put it on the screen for a couple of seconds max. Okay? Cool. So the first thing that I want to do is actually something that I think is quite important, which is an exercise in self-reflection. Essentially, how often do you think about what you are not thinking about? And the reason I'm asking this is basically because I think a lot of people feel like they don't need to go and try and learn about social identities in particular. And so either they think, oh, I already know about this one, so it's fine, or they just think, I don't need to know about it because it's not something I can learn about. I'm not sure what that means, but it is a pitfall that I feel like a lot of debaters face. And so the first thing that I'd like everyone to do is to get out a sheet of paper. And I think it's really important to do this, because this is an exercise that I did myself when I was trying to learn, and it was really useful to me in terms of guiding how I tried to broaden my own horizons. Whether it improves your debating or not, I can't promise, but what I can promise is that it'll hopefully make you a better person. So get out a sheet of paper, and I would like you to fold it horizontally in the middle. So basically, if you have a sheet of paper, fold it in half like this. Okay, so there's a top half and a bottom half. All right, you've all got one? And then what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think, which is basically, what is the type of social identity debate that if it came up in a debating tournament, would I feel most comfortable with? Okay, so you know, it might be that you feel you could debate very well about race, but not very well about gender. Or it might be that you feel very comfortable with class, but not with disability. Or it might be that you don't feel like you could talk about sexuality, but you would feel very comfortable talking about being from the developing world. What is it that is the thing that you consider most accessible to you? And if you think nothing is accessible to you, then what is the least inaccessible to you? Because it's likely that there is going to be something you're better at and something you're worse at. And once you've written that on the top half of the sheet of paper, I want you to try and write on the bottom half the opposite. So the social identity you feel the least comfortable debating about. Okay? So for example, I still feel as though I don't know enough about disability rights. I feel very kind of, not out of my depth necessarily, but feel like there were often arguments that I didn't have as much knowledge about if I had to talk about disability. And don't feel ashamed for doing this. This is part of the process of learning, because what you know and what you don't know are important to target what you learn. Otherwise, you're just going to spend more time reading about something you already know a lot about. And it's not to say that there isn't a benefit to that. It's just not necessarily something that's that helpful to you. Okay? So when you've done that, I think the first question I want you to think about is what is different about these two? So why is there one on the top half of your paper and one on the bottom half of your paper? Yeah, well, there's a bunch of potential answers. I think one of the most common ones is I've experienced this thing, and so I feel like I have more knowledge about it, but I don't know about this other thing. Or it might be that, you know, this is discussed a lot more in the news, so I'm more aware of it, but I have absolutely no idea about the developing world. Or it might be I've come across this a lot in debates, but not this other thing, and so I have less access to arguments people have been making around it. This brings me to the first important thing I wanted you to take away though, which is that you aren't expected to be magically good at social justice debating, and nobody is. But if there is something that you have more knowledge about compared to less knowledge, you shouldn't treat it any differently to how debaters treat things like economics or political systems or learning about justice or learning about international relations. You just have to go out there and go out of your way to try and read about the things you don't know. So if you do a degree in politics, you might find it more easy for you to talk about political systems and voting and voter behavior than it is for you to talk about something like women's issues. And that's completely expectable because that is something that is outside of your easily accessible set of knowledge. But there's no reason why you can't actively try and overcome this, okay? But there's two other things that I think are important. So the first is that there are similarities between many aspects of social oppression. So for those of you that were here for the pre-stream intersectional debating session, we talked about radical feminism and liberal feminism, but also how a lot of the underlying schools of thought of those ideologies could be applied to other situations. Those structures are often equivocable or equivalent, if not identical. So understanding that, so for example, if you're very good at talking about the manifestations of oppression for gender, understanding that there might be similar manifestations of oppression for class that use similar avenues, for example, or play out in similar ways, can be a useful starting point. And that can help to already plug some of the gap. But the other thing is that don't act as though they are exactly identical. If that was true, then we wouldn't separate out race and gender. We just say that they are all under one big umbrella somehow. And I think people in the debating community in particular have a tendency to homogenize them. So you'll be at a tournament, you'll say, okay, so we had an economics debate, we had an IR debate, now it's time for some social justice debate, as though debates about sexuality are exactly the same as debates about class, are exactly the same as debates about race. There might be similarities, but they're not exactly identical, and that's because the way race is constructed and manifested is different to the way gender is constructed and manifested. And so, as well as writing down what is similar between the two, work out what makes this unique or makes this distinct. I can't do that work for you because we're talking about, maybe 7 or 8 common ways in which this can play out within debating, and we don't have time for all of them. But over the course of this presentation, if you find yourself learning about one aspect that you've written down on your sheet of paper, take a note of it, and then try and fill in the equivalent gap on the one that you know the least about. Okay, so this is just an exercise that you might find useful, you might find it completely useless, but essentially it says, something that I am more capable at, how can I use that to help me, if not learn about something that I'm less capable at, to help me know what to learn about something that I'm less capable at. Okay, so here's what this presentation is going to talk about. So it's going to start with just analyzing oppression in isolation. And this is going to be quite generalized because I think knowing that generalized structure is really important for being able to debate well about it. The next thing it's going to do is it's going to look at intersectionality in particular. Then I'm going to talk through some specific facets of oppression. So I've got social oppression and then societal oppression. And then finally, I have some common clashes in debates about social identity. So these last two slides, basically there are a bunch of bullet points that'll say like X versus Y, and those can be applied, I think, to something like 90% of the debates I've seen on social identity. So if you start to understand what the underlying clashes are and get good at coming up with some arguments for and against, then that might help you, because then when you face a specific debate, you can just identify the clash, and then all you have to do is come up with the content around the specific context rather than inventing it for yourself from scratch. Okay, so let's get on to analyzing oppression. So in general, I find it useful to think of social oppression as being constructed of about 3 parts, and then there are different lenses through which you can experience that. So one lens might be through the lens of gender, or another lens might be through the lens of being a person of color. But actually there are, in general, only 3 parts to all forms of social oppression. So the first is the one that's the most obvious to see, and that's formal barriers. Okay, and these are things like laws that explicitly discriminate between different groups, or policies that explicitly discriminate between different groups. The second are informal barriers. So these are actions which cause some form of discrimination, but that are not themselves codified. So for example, catcalling is an informal barrier towards women's liberation, because it's not some sort of rule that women should be catcalled, but the fact that you're more likely to face harassment if you're a woman in public spaces ends up influencing the way women's experiences are. So that's an informal barrier. And then the third, and this is the one I think debaters are the worst at talking about, are problematic constructions. So this is the very notion of masculinity and femininity. This is the very idea of race as being some form of distinguishing characteristic between individuals. The 3 of them are related, and the way that a lot of people think they're related is like this, right? So we have some sort of distinguishing problematic construction between people of different genders, that then informally feeds through into people's attitudes and behaviors, and then eventually those people with these informal barriers go on to make laws, and then those laws cement formal barriers to genders within your society. But actually it works both ways, right? So formal barriers can end up legitimizing or creating disparities which end up cementing informal attitudes and stereotypes. Those informal attitudes and stereotypes then end up ingraining forms of social organization that are themselves problematic. So it actually works in both ways, and this is one of the, I actually think one of the most interesting ways that you can have a debate about social identities, which is if you're trying to achieve some sort of liberation, should you start by unpicking problematic constructions and then go down, waiting for that to filter through into people's attitudes and then into formal laws? Or do you start by removing formal discriminations first, waiting for people's attitudes to change in response to that, which eventually allow you to unpick the very notion of gender or race? Yeah, question.
With something like a forum or like an institution that's not like defined by law, but it's like a very strong, like the Red Pill on Reddit, which is an institution specifically designed against the oppression of women. Is that like an informal, like a strong informal barrier, or is that like the formal barrier that isn't law?
So obviously these categories aren't holistic, because there are going to be things that kind of straddle the two. So for those of you that maybe didn't catch the question, the example we were given was the Red Pill on Reddit, which is a misogynistic forum. That is an informal barrier in a lot of ways, because it doesn't control what women outside that space can do. Does that make sense? And so it's just a bunch of people expressing attitudes, but you can't say that that necessarily leads to women being materially well off, less well off rather, or facing violence themselves, except through the way it feeds into people's attitudes otherwise, right? So formal barriers tend to be much more social, and you can't opt out of the formal barriers. Informal barriers you can opt out of, but if you are within that space, you can still face some form of violence, right? So e.g., Black people could not opt out of slavery or segregation in the United States. There are still hugely racist parts of the US, but that racism isn't something that's codified in law. I mean, it's codified in law. It's not something that's like explicitly sanctioned by law. It's actually something that they face due to individuals choosing to take it upon themselves to enact racism, rather than the state taking it upon themselves to enact racism. And that's why there isn't an arrow connecting a problematic construction to a formal barrier, right? Because the one on the far left and the one on the far right aren't. The one on the far left and the one on the far right are not people, they are systems, and the people are in the middle, causing notions to circulate and become prevalent, and also causing social organization to be discriminatory. but the people are the informal barrier, right? Because you can't police what people think. And in most cases, we decide not to police what people say. Okay, so just an example of this might be, so legal or structural systems that cause disadvantage, uncodified behavior, sports, and social norms. So the red pill is uncodified. And then frameworks and categorization that form ideas of normative identity. And I talked about lenses. If you're following along on the PowerPoint presentation, there are actually often footnotes that will direct you to further readings or more academic phrasings of this. So a more academic phrasing of this might be a vector of oppression, which is a direction through which you experience oppression. But you can think of it as basically a perspective. And so from the perspective of race, you might see something like this. So legal discrimination, segregation, slavery is formal. Informal, you have things like prejudice, stereotype, sexual fetishization, and abuse. Problematic construction is just the very notion of race itself, right? Like the idea that race exists or has any salience is a problematic construction. And you can easily identify that race is kind of an arbitrary construction, but just based on the fact that race has changed so much over time and in different places. So, so if you go to the United States, Irish Americans until very recently were seen as a race, whereas that wouldn't necessarily be a distinguishing factor we make here. You wouldn't see Irish people as a different race in the UK anymore, and actually in a lot of the US they would. And likewise, in India, a lot of people would consider me to be mixed race or mixed ethnicity because my parents are North Indian and South Indian, which have different ethnic backgrounds. But in the West, I'm just seen as Indian, which is seen as the same race as people who are from Pakistan and from Sri Lanka and from Bangladesh and anyone else who's from South Asia. So the notion of race itself is so variable, I think that should already provide you with some hints that it's not necessarily particularly real, because even within the present day, we vary so much on how we decide what race is, and across time, even more so. And then likewise, the same might apply to things like sexuality. So we've got criminalization of sexuality, or things like bathroom bills for other parts of the LGBT movement, donor laws banning the donation of blood. Those are formal discrimination. Informal barriers might be things like queerphobia or bashing, or even the notion of like gay best friends. But then that actually comes from problematic constructions that say things like your biology should be determinant of your identity, or that say things like your gender and sexuality are unchanging, or even that there are specific notions of masculinity and femininity that you have to conform to. Again, all of these can be shown to be arbitrary constructions based on the fact that our notion of what is feminine or masculine has changed. You go back to the 1600s, and all the male aristocrats in Europe are wearing high heels and frilly dresses and huge wigs, right? Nowadays, we call them drag queens. Back then, we called them the Sun King. But the notion of what is masculine or feminine, and the idea that that should be inherent, that notion itself is a problematic construction. Okay, so how does this then feed through into oppressions? And this is where I think it's really important, is that people never talk about how these structures or these actions end up influencing people like on the ground, basically. And they basically say, but that is a racist action, and no one ever explains in the debate how that feeds into racism and oppression. And so what I'm going to provide you is a kind of circular system, and then whatever the topic you're facing generally will fit into the system somehow. Okay, so at some point, there is some initial disparity, right? The reason for that initial disparity can be hugely variable. The most kind of unfair one maybe is an accident. So accidentally, they invent steam technology in Europe before they invent it in anywhere else in the world. So the Industrial Revolution happens in Western European countries before it happens elsewhere, which causes a disparity in terms of technological capabilities, which ultimately allowed European colonial empires to colonize the rest of the world, as opposed to African colonial empires, which ultimately cemented systems of poverty and prosperity that then also feed through to immigrant rhetoric and race rhetoric in the modern day, right? So you can see how actually something completely accidental has over time fed through into a huge disadvantage. Or it can be something biological. So for example, one of the many theories of gender disparity says that it stems from pregnancy, in which obviously people with uteruses would get pregnant, but people without uteruses would not. And so we decided that since human beings, when they are pregnant, face 9 months of great vulnerability when they are unable to acquire their own food, that created a dependency in which women would have to depend upon males within their social circle to take care of them during this time, which allowed men in return to demand some form of subservience as a payment for this protection, which might eventually have spread out into social norms in which women are subservient to men, right? That's one theory, but the point is, there is some initial disparity that occurs. There is some way in which people are different. That difference can be as basic as there are fewer of you. Okay, so the fact that there are, as far as we know, fewer LGBT people than non-LGBT people in the population already creates a power dynamic in which you are the smaller group, you might have less power because there are fewer of you. And the same would apply for migrants, right? So in most circumstances, migrants make up a minority of the population, and that creates a disparity between two groups in terms of their numbers. So after this disparity is created, those who benefit from the disparity have more power, and they use that power to create power structures which cement their power into place. And the reason they do this is because essentially they're self-interested, right? So if you are benefiting from the fact that all the women are subservient to you, even as technology later develops to make it so that women don't need to depend on you for food, because now we have capitalism and we buy food from other people who are growing the food for us, you still want to make sure that you protect the benefits you're getting from that initial disparity. So social norms are constructed, stereotypes are constructed, laws are constructed, which try and cement that disparity. I'm using, like the idea of pregnancy and gender as an example here, but in any circumstance, this might be the case. So slavery is a classic example of this. Even after slavery, a number of white land and slave owners wanted to be compensated for the fact that they had to lose their slaves. A huge amount of them were compensated for that, and that then contributed to economic disparities between the African American population and the non-African American population. So power structures are established by those who benefit from disparities. And then the perpetuation of these disparities means that they are disproportionately reinforced through biases. And I think the easiest way to explain this is illusory correlation. So illusory in the sense of false. It's a false correlation that is drawn based on observed behaviors. Okay, does anyone know what this is? Yeah, it's a Rorschach test. Essentially, this is an ink blot, right? So the way that they're made is that someone spills colored ink onto one half of a piece of paper. They then fold the piece of paper together, and so when they open it, they produce a symmetric image that pretty much is random. And they've fallen out of fashion hugely now, but they were a preferred tool of psychoanalysis for a lot of the 20th century. Okay, I'm gonna ask you a question. What gender are these figures? Or do you even see figures? Okay, so you definitely see figures. What gender are they?
I see like women parts and not like organized.
Okay. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Okay, put your hand up if you think you see men. Put your hand up if you think you see women. Put your hand up if you see both or you're not sure. Okay, so all of you, pretty much all of you, put your hands up. This is one of the Wheeler tests for male homosexuality. In around 1939, or by 1939, being unable to identify the gender of figures in this card, and the same cards are used in the Rorschach tests each time. So this is card number 3, I think, was a sign of psychosexual trauma or male homosexuality. So as far as psychologists from the 1930s are concerned, you will demonstrate a trait of male homosexuality. And this was then cemented by studies. So they then would do a study and they find that actually gay men were more likely to see these people as not having a gender. But what was actually happening was an illusory correlation. Okay, so before I go into exactly what that is, one more experiment. I need a volunteer. See? Okay, I want you to come up to the front. Okay, so come closer. Okay, so here is a blank screen. At the very start of this presentation, I flashed for a few seconds a screen that had a bunch of faces on it. Touch a point on this board where one of the faces was. Any of the faces. Okay, so that is kind of to the center, slightly to the right. Let's take a look. So this is from a book called Measuring the Weight of Smoke, which looks at psychological association. And basically, respondents repeatedly would remember subconsciously where the one face that was different to the, you can sit down now, by the way, where the one face that was different to the other faces was, and this would apply to a whole bunch of examples. So in this scenario, you have a bunch of faces, they're all frowning at you, but people are more likely to remember the specific position of the face that is of a different color. And this is actually quite a normal response in human beings because we use something called heuristic thinking. And essentially what that says is, because we have to make shortcuts, our brain defers to very subconscious forms of association. And those subconscious forms of association tend to remember the characteristics of statistical minorities ahead of statistical majorities. Which brings me back to the Rorschach test. So the Rorschach test was debunked by some of the people who started developing these theories, because they eventually found that straight men would identify gender confusion within the figures at completely equal rates as gay men would. But essentially respondents or researchers would disproportionately remember the times in which this happened and they turned out to be gay. And that would then influence the types of results that they were returning. And obviously it was the 1930s, we had slightly different rules on what we considered to be clinically acceptable. But essentially, pre-built biases were then being disproportionately reinforced because a statistical minority was more memorable to us than otherwise. So likewise, from the same textbook, there's an example of two aliens, Zarks and Glorks, and there's a bunch of different individuals. You can see that there are twice as many Glorks as Zarks, and they each have different names. So the names here are given as letters. And when we read out to an individual, so you can see it in the table, it's quite clear here, but when we read out to individuals in alphabetical order what each of these people did, so A, a Glork helped the MEMS, and then the next person would be E, a Zark helped the MEMS, and the next person might be L, a Glork helped the MEMS, then R, a Glork harmed the MEMS, and so on and so forth. So we read them out in a kind of random order. And then we say, you're at a dinner party, would you rather sit next to a Zark or a Glork? People disproportionately say that they would rather sit next to a Glork. Okay? Even though they have the same likelihood of doing a harmful behavior as a helpful behavior, people disproportionately favor the larger groups. And this is indicative of a range of other studies in which, as well as remembering the characteristics of statistical minorities, people are far more likely to ascribe negative behaviors or antisocial behaviors, or to remember the antisocial behaviors of those statistical minorities. So back to my recipe for, wait, do you have a question?
What's the name of that? The name for that natural assumption that the small group is the weak part to put.
Yeah, so that's just heuristics. And the best paper I would recommend for heuristics would be Kahneman and Tversky, Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. Oh, actually, it's in the footnote to here. And they go through a whole bunch of different ways in which we make these assumptions. So another one that's really interesting is adjustment and anchoring. If you ask people how many African countries there are in the UN, but you start with the number 15, they will estimate something like 25. If you say how many African countries are in the UN, but you are showing them the number 60, they'll adjust down, they'll correctly identify it's fewer than 60, but they'll adjust down by the same number, so they'll adjust down by 10 and say there are 50. And actually they'll be nowhere near the true number, which is something like that. So there are a bunch, it's really interesting reading. But basically, illusory correlation theory means that they disproportionately overweight unusual or salient examples and are more likely to ascribe negative characteristics to minorities. So what this means is you ignore all the times that someone white is on your TV screen because they've shot up a school or they've mugged somebody. But then when someone black does that, or when someone who's Muslim does that, that becomes more memorable to you. And then eventually, when you're not faced with an immediate example, but you're trying to think of who you remember committing acts of violence, you're slightly more likely to think that that happens for minority groups. And the same might ascribe to things like women. So you might see some women as being, for example, weaker or whatever, and then you say all women must be weaker as a result of that, because you ignore all the pathetic weak men out there. So that's the theory anyway. But the problem is, this illusory correlation then ends up legitimizing the power structure that's established. So there's a power structure that's established, or there's a stereotype or a norm, and then you, having been primed by that stereotype, and then thinking in this way, think, oh yeah, that stereotype must be based on truth. There's no smoke without fire, etc. And this ends up feeding through into behaviors, which mean that power structures get reaffirmed. A great example of this, this is actually one that Dee talks about in her presentation also, is that when girls are reminded of their gender before a maths test, they perform worse on the maths test. And the same is actually true of African American children. So when you remind African American children of their gender, they then perform worse on the test that they do, compared to how they've been doing previously, compared to their previous averages. And so even at a very subconscious level, from a hugely young age, the ability of our subconscious associations to feed through to our behaviors and affect us, and affect how we see other people, and even ourselves, can be huge. Yeah.
This is where internalizing stuff comes from, right?
Exactly. So this is where internalization comes from. And I think people talk about internalization a lot in debating. So what they say is that you internalize these beliefs, and then the way debaters go from it is, and then you feel bad, or you feel excluded from society. And that's true. I'm not saying it's untrue, but what they don't realize is that actually it goes further than that. It isn't even that you necessarily see it. It's that having absorbed that behavior, the way you then interact with other individuals changes, and that changes even whether you take up opportunities or put yourself forward for opportunities. It changes whether you end up getting jobs or not, and so on and so forth. And that internalization eventually spirals into larger disparities. Okay, so social norms get legitimized, and then what happens? Well, deviating from those power structures is now seen as a challenge to all of society because so many people have bought into the social norms. So illusory correlation theory means everyone does think that black people are thugs. They're crossing the street when someone black is walking towards them. Bill Clinton is calling them super predators when he's president. And so then anybody who's fighting against that is seen as challenging widespread beliefs, being wrong, being ideological, etc. And so this ends up legitimizing the exclusion of people who are challenging the status quo. So that's why people feel much more vindicated in using policing to challenge the Black Lives Matter protests than they feel using policing to challenge a very white middle class, women's march on Washington, in which people aren't seeing them as threats. Or likewise, the march in Charlottesville, which is a white supremacist march, was barely policed at all. The police were there for the protection of the marchers because that was not seen as much of a challenge to the subconscious beliefs that a lot of people hold within society. Okay, so then step 3 of the recipe for aggression is that individuals are also often internalizing their own norms and expectations about behavior. But the problem with that is that then everyone else can say, but they're choosing this life for themselves. Look at them. Women are choosing not to go for that job at the corporation, or they're choosing to stay at home, or they're choosing to take time off to look after their kids. So what goes further than just the fact that people feel legitimate in believing those things is they even start to ignore the fact that this is something that is caused by other people's actions, and instead they view it as an individualist choice. And in particular, some people argue that this is much more common in societies in which we already buy into tropes of individualism in general. So if we're already saying, you choose what happens to you, you are responsible for your own social mobility, maybe people are more likely to buy into that. I don't know, but that's something you could definitely argue. I think the other thing that happens is that within groups where people are being oppressed, you then get further oppression. So colorism is an example I've listed here, is basically when even within non-white communities, there is a preference for people who are fair skinned versus people who are darker skinned. So a lot of Indians, for example, will buy Fair and Lovely, is the best known brand of like skin whitening cream, because there's a huge beauty standard for fairer skinned Indian women versus darker skinned Indian women. Even though all Indian women are facing racism, within that community, there's still a tendency for racism. Or likewise, white women permitting and reinforcing tropes of black male aggression, the idea that feminists can be transphobic, etc., etc. So there's a lot of ways in which minority groups also end up internalizing forms of oppression and oppressive ways of thinking, and then use that against other members of minority groups. So oppressions don't exist in isolation. They instead support and intertwine with one another. And then individuals that face multiple oppressions end up having to live with their intersections and facing more issues as a result of that. This is important though, because what you will notice I've done is I've talked about so if you go back a couple of slides, and then after the initial disparities thing, the idea that there's some cementing of those initial disparities, everything from there to here, then the last line of this is, this then feeds into how people vote, construct laws, how they behave, how they organize their societies, cementing power structures, right? So it's a cycle. And so it doesn't matter where in the cycle you're going with it, it all feeds through eventually to a system of oppression that is self-perpetuating. And this is what's important for debating, I think, is that people sometimes start with this. They say, but now you're less likely to buy into the idea that other members of your community are unequal. Well, okay, well, what's that mean? What's the importance of that? Knowing about the whole cycle is useful because you can then talk through how that spills out into a broader area. And I think a lot of times when people say that they find social justice debates to be a little bit abstract or airy-fairy or not having real consequences, that's because they don't know how to relate things that are happening at the level of individual interactions or at the level of the way people are thinking to broader social changes or broader social structures. So this recipe is the way that we do that. Okay, before we move on, does anyone have any questions? Okay, perfect. So, intersectionality. Someone tell me what they think intersectionality is. Now.
It's considering other sort of things like modes of repression with each other, like class alongside race and gender and disability, like all at once or at separate points.
Yeah, exactly. So it's essentially a way in which we relate together oppressions as not happening in isolation. And in particular, this was a response to a lot of prevailing thought in the 1960s and 70s, in which academics or theorists would try and present a particular type of oppression or a particular type of identity as being the principal prism through which other identities stand. So for a lot of Marxist theorists, that was class, and gender and race were manifestations of the class oppression. For a lot of gender theorists, it was gender, and class oppression was a manifestation of the way in which women themselves were seen as property. And likewise, for a lot of race theorists, race is the primary vector of oppression, which then further goes on to the way in which Black women are treated and poor people are treated as well. But intersectionality is essentially a way in which we try and overcome that by recognizing the ways in which they interact with each other as perhaps being separate. The problem is a lot of people are kind of not that great at describing intersectionality properly. So I'm going to give you a brief history lesson about this. Okay, so it initially comes from feminism and feminist scholarship. And if you were to Google intersectionality, most of the stuff that you would find concerns the intersection between gender and race. That isn't all intersectionality is, but that's where a lot of the origins of this school of thought lie. And Kimberly Williams-Crenshaw was the one who eventually coined the term. It essentially seeks to challenge the idea that a single structure can be wholly determinant of a person's life experiences, but it also seeks to de-homogenize our social groups. So as well as saying, yeah, race isn't the only thing that affects you, or class isn't the only thing that affects you, it basically says not all women have the same experience, not all poor people have the same experience, not all people who are non-white have the same experience. And it aims to go one step further and also tries to dehomogenize social theory, essentially by including the opinions and voices of people who are currently being disincluded. So for example, non-Western voices in feminism is a way of decolonizing or intersectionalizing feminism, okay? Or the inclusion of non-white people of color into the LGBT kind of queer theory movement is another way of doing that. What most people think intersectionality is basically this, right? Like you face some oppression, and then there's some other oppression, and then there's some people in this group in the middle that face both oppressions, and then for most people there's one oppression unit, for the other group there's an oppression unit, and then the people in the middle face twice as much oppression, right? Like this is a very basic understanding of intersectionality. Whenever I've seen intersectionality in debating, 90% of the time it's been like this, that there's multiple oppressions at once, and then some people have it twice as bad off. Intersectionality is way more than that. And I think that that form of debating is not necessarily the most useful either. Because as well as the idea that somebody faces both oppressions simultaneously, what I think is important to get used to arguing is that it's not just addition, it's kind of like a multiplication. There are some unique outcomes that people face as a result. And like, all the time I see people shoehorning in minorities into a debate, right? So the top half of the debate will talk about how some economic policy will end up benefiting those that are poorest in society and reducing inequality. And then their closing half will say, and this affects women who are socially unequal and monetarily unequal as well. And they'll walk off and think they've produced a valid extension, and they haven't really, because all they've done is identify a group. And even if you provide tons of analysis as to why women are worse off, that's just a subgroup of all people who opening half have talked about. And unless the mechanism is affecting women in some different way, you actually are just picking a smaller version of the group of people that are being affected by opening half's analysis, right? So it's good to identify that women are more likely to be financially disadvantaged than men, but that doesn't do anything because it's just an identification. What is much more useful is to talk about the fact that sometimes there are unique oppressions that only exist at the intersection, okay? So there might be oppressions that only non-white women face, that white people, that white women don't face, and that non-white people in general don't face. And that is an example of analysis that now isn't just duplicating what another team has done, but instead is identifying a unique mechanism or a unique interaction which allows that minority group not to just become something that's shoehorned in. And a lot of the questions that I got online essentially hinged on this. They basically said, okay, but what do I do about the fact that people often just bring up a minority group? I feel like I'm always using the same tropes. Well, actually, this is it, right? What is so unique about this intersection of oppression that means the analysis underpinning it is not just what other teams are talking about? And then the benefit that you're identifying, or the harm that you're identifying, is also logically ascribed to your contributions and your analysis in the debate. Secondly, is that there are tensions within social movements themselves. This doesn't mean like hostility. Like, it can mean hostility, but essentially it means that sometimes you have to make choices on what policy you're going to be supporting, and you can't pick one without disadvantaging one kind of constituent group within your movement, and you can't pick their preferred version without disadvantaging another constituent group in your movement. So what do? Right? And a good example of this might be whether LGBT people should use the campaigning rhetoric that people are born that way. Okay, a ton of LGBT people don't feel like they're born that way. A ton of LGBT people feel like it delegitimizes the idea that you should support people that are making these decisions regardless of whether they're choosing to or not, right? Because it ties into a lot of the associations that people have of like mental illness or physical sickness with being LGBT. But at the same time, the more that you move away from that movement, the harder it becomes for trans people to argue that their gender identity is something that's inherent to them, and it is something that they ought to have validated by society. Because the more you're telling individuals that these are choices and we should respect them as choices and that the state should not have interference with them, the easier it becomes to underpin that idea, but then to support the idea that trans people are just playing dress up somehow. And so that's one example of a way in which there could be a tension within social movements themselves. And this is, by this I mean ideological tension. And then finally, and I think this is the most interesting one for debating, is that even when there aren't individuals themselves that are at the intersection, the same social structures or same systems might govern multiple individuals. So a good example of this would be the more that we break down the idea that there is something inherent about masculinity, or that masculinity is preferable, obviously there are going to be benefits for women who are no longer disadvantaged by the fact everyone ascribes femininity to them. But also, there are huge advantages to LGBT people. Why? Because a lot of, I think, queerphobia can be interpreted as an interpretation of misogyny, right? There's a reason why so many straight men will happily watch lesbian porn, but are disgusted by the idea of watching anal sex, and particularly of the idea of receiving anal sex. And that's because to receive, which is seen as feminine, is also seen as disgusting or humiliating, or like it lowers somebody. So the same social structure, which is the preference of masculinity, or the idea of masculinity as being more respectable than femininity, governs both a lot of misogyny and a lot of queerphobia, but the two aren't related. We don't have to be talking about queer women. In fact, this almost exclusively does not affect queer women, in particular, this one particular attraction I've identified, but actually the same system governs both. So that's another thing that can be super interesting in debating, is if you're having a debate that's talking a lot about one particular group, you can talk about the interaction between that group and the debate and the social structure, and then bring in other groups in ways that isn't necessarily tokenistic, because what you're doing is you're providing analysis as to how they're also affected. And that's, I think, a big part also of what it means to be intersectional, is to recognize that groups are related to one another. Okay, so the next 4 slides are just a bunch of examples. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about them. The aim of this is that you can understand some of the ways in which this comes up. If you have any questions about them, just put your hand up and we can spend more time discussing it. But ideally, people can use these slides afterwards to go and use this as like a starting point for their own research. These are just things that I personally find interesting. Okay, so non-white women face racialized beauty standards, and many beauty norms derive from European physical characteristics, which excludes women of color. So the more acceptance we get for like women validating their own beauty, the more we might end up harming women of color who are never getting that validation. And racial characteristics, on the other hand, often get fetishized. So racial fetishization, or the idea that, you know, like people want curvy black women or they want demure East Asian women, those are harms that white women in general aren't facing. Yes, white women do face sexualization, but they don't face racial fetishization. And at the same time, that isn't something that men of color are facing in general. So this is a unique intersection of oppression that only affects non-white women, or mostly affects non-white women. Moreover, there's a beauty hypocrisy. So even when these characteristics eventually do get celebrated, they're predominantly celebrated on white women rather than on non-white women. So on non-white women, for example, braids and dreadlocks are seen as unprofessional. On white women, they're seen as fashion forward. Right? On non-white women, their big lips. On African-American women, that seems undesirable. Kylie Jenner has big lips and it sparks a new fashion trend. And so there's a number of ways in which this might play out. I sometimes give a presentation called Decolonizing Your Debating, which focuses on race in particular. And a good example of this is the Kim Kardashian Break the Internet photo, right? Where she's on the cover of People magazine and she has a champagne bottle. Champagne bottle is pouring over her head to a champagne glass that's balanced on her bottom. And that was seen as such an empowering moment, and women were being sexual and whatever. But what a lot of people don't realize is that that photo was photographed by the same photographer as one in which there is a black woman from the 1970s who is essentially being racially fetishized in ways that are very reminiscent of the ways people talk about slaves. And all of that, back in the 1970s, was an allusion to the Hottentot Venus. So the Hottentot Venus was a member of a South African indigenous tribe who, on account of her facial features, was literally shopped around zoos in the Victorian era because she was seen as like a freak commodity, so people would pay to see her. And so all of those undertones in which non-white women are seen as being exotic, sexually strange, almost alien or different to other human beings, are then seen as celebrating and empowering on white women. And when Kim Kardashian did it, the discussion, by and large in the mainstream media, was about sexual norms and sexual liberation, and Kim Kardashian's like star power, rather than on the racial history of the photograph that she was taking. Or incidentally of the fact that the white male photographer, who had all of the power to produce these images, himself had been accused by a number of individuals of racial fetishization in his photography. So the beauty hypocrisy, that's an example of that. Okay, so example number 2. LGBT violence, hugely racialized. 70% of LGBT people who are murdered are people of color. The statistics for trans individuals as a proportion of that are also scarily high. So intersectionally, there is some divergence between the pressing issues that face one group versus another group, right? So white LGBT people, and particularly white gay men, have the benefit of being able to talk about things like equal marriage, but actually there are much more tangible physical concerns that are more primary for a number of LGBT people of color. Sexual racism, super prevalent within the LGBT community. So this is not just the idea that you consider a group sexually unattractive or attractive. Even apps like Grindr literally provide the capacity for you to filter out people from races and only see matches that are from a certain race. But it also includes things like bouncers are less likely to let non-white people into clubs. Now this is true of straight clubs also, right? So I grew up in Birmingham, which has a huge multicultural population, and large groups of non-white men would not get into clubs because bouncers were worried that might turn off white women or white men because it would be seen as a non-white club or whatever. So maybe to some extent this is a broader trend, but it's particularly harmful for LGBT people of color. Why? Because there are very few queer spaces where you can openly be sexual or openly be around other people that are LGBT. And if you're not being let into these clubs, where is there for you, right? Or gentrification, or the assimilation of queer villages into the mainstream is celebrated by a lot of individuals because it means that they don't have to feel ashamed or they don't have to hide anymore. But that's only true for people who can generally feel comfortable walking down the street holding hands. If you come from a very conservative background, or if you come from a religious minority, or even if you come from a queer community where there is a lot of internalized queerphobia. For example, a lot of people of color come from communities where social norms have also entitled them to think that it is not, so e.g. it's not Indian to be gay. You might feel much more afraid about that because you can't just walk down the street in public holding hands with a partner and get seen by somebody and face those risks. Whereas you might have felt safer doing that in a queer district where a lot of those homophobes are unlikely to be. So sexual racism is an example of this. Carceral feminism. Does anyone know what carceral feminism is? So carceral, as in incarceration, is to do with prison. Essentially, this is a form of feminism which, in order to try and control sexual assault and sexual harassment, advocates for stricter policing, harsher sentencing, etc., of people who are accused of sexual assault and sexual harassment, which is great until you remember that the police is also a tool that oppresses Black women, and Black women largely don't go to the police, nor unlikely to go to the police. And it also tends to over-police black men who, you know, sometimes are even falsely accused of things like sexual aggression, because that's the stereotype we've built up. And so the consequence of this is what seems to be benefiting women on the whole actually ends up disproportionately harming black women and black families, whereas white women don't feel the negative consequences of proposing greater sentencing. So that is a form of feminism in which there is an internal tension. Another example is lean-in feminism. So lean-in feminism basically says that we should support women who are corporate and they ought to lean in and be more assertive in workplaces, which is great until you remember that poor women aren't in workplaces at all. So the more that you have feminism advocating for things like workplace creches and paternity leave, it's great for all of those women, but perhaps you have less advocacy for the idea that the state itself should provide more welfare, for example, free childcare for women, especially because rich women are unlikely to advocate paying higher taxes, right? Like, how much money does somebody like Sheryl Sandberg have to earn before she eventually is like, no, I'm going to pay a ton of tax now? And so lean-in feminism is an example of that, in which there's a kind of tension between the interests of two groups. Whether there is that trade-off, by the way, is up for debate. I don't mean to say that it is, but you could argue that there is that trade-off. And I think the question is quite unresolved there. Okay, the rejection of religion and social activism. Ton of people reject religion and social activism. They say that religion itself is inherently oppressive. Might be true, but there's also a bunch of people who are religious. And so the idea that you're rejecting religion might disassociate them or disincentivize them to participate in feminism or LGBT liberation, etc. Sex positivity, another classic example of this. Wait, you had a question?
Kind of. I was on about the rejection of religion. Do you reckon it stems more from a general trend of towards sexualization of society, or specifically from like a particular idea that religion has typically been?
It can be both. So I think during the second wave, there was much, before secularization was itself widespread, there was a movement that basically said religion itself was oppressive. And this is at the same time that feminists were saying, look, like marriage itself is oppressive. We should choose not to get married. And so it kind of follows from that the idea that some social structure should dictate roles to you itself was unacceptable. I think the two kind of work hand in hand, though. Definitely, though, a lot of justifications for liberation tend to be wholly secular and outright tend to reject religion. It doesn't help that a lot of anti-social movement groups draw from religion, right? So evangelical Christians, for example, in the US, are very against things like trans rights and the extension of gender rights. And that's up for debate. And actually, so liberation theology, have you guys heard of that? So liberation theology started within the civil rights movement for African Americans in the 1960s and 70s. Essentially, it draws on specifically religious justifications for the ending of racism. And basically says, like, look, here is an interpretation of what is in the Bible that says that this is what you ought to be following. And I think there's a hugely interesting set of debates in there, and set of discussions in there about the extent to which that itself is alienating to people who are non-Christian, or for whom religion has been used to oppress them. So for example, if you've been taken to an LGBT clinic in which people are electroshock therapying you into conversion, then conversion to being straight, because of religion, you might not be so happy about the fact that all of a sudden religion is being used as the justification for LGBT rights. But likewise, a lot of people are born into religious families, do grow up within religious households, and are LGBT, and so it can be useful for them to be included. There was a motion at Tallinn EUDC about this, which was that the LGBT movement should include side B Christians into the movement's mainstream. Side B Christianity, as defined in the information slide, as essentially Christians who do see themselves as being LGBT and don't see that as being in conflict with scripture. Okay, sex positivity, another good example of this. So a lot of feminists basically say sex is great, we should be pro-sex, ignoring the fact that for a number of women, sex can be a tool of oppression. So for example, migrant or trafficked workers, you can be pro-sex work and that's part of sex positivity, but it ignores the fact that it's disproportionately migrants or women of color that do face coercive sex work, and it might be harder to unpack that. The vice versa of that, sex negativity, also causes tension though, because you basically say, no, we should be against the sexualization of women. Women shouldn't be sexualizing themselves because that form of empowerment is one that derives from the validation of men, which is great until you remember that non-white women are far more likely to be told that they're not sexually desirable. And so actually a particularly important aspect of their empowerment is to be able to see themselves as sexually assertive and desirable beings. So what are we supposed to do? Sex positivity excludes people, sex negativity excludes people, sex neutrality helps nobody, so we need to have some solution, but actually we can't. And that's what intersectionality basically concludes at a lot of times is there's no one solution, but instead we ought to be mindful of different aspects of this, so at least we know what trade-offs we're making and can try, if anything, to compensate for it. Okay, an emphasis on public protest and a lack of accessible public space. If you've ever organized an event without checking that it is wheelchair accessible, congratulations, by default, you've held an ableist event, right? So if there's a feminist space that's upstairs and there's no lift, women in wheelchairs can't attend that space, which means their voices are much less likely to be heard. And emphasis on public protest, so saying that public protest is the most important. You need to be marching down streets, well, that excludes people for whom mobility is an issue. This is just an example. But basically, the lack of accessible public space or the lack of emphasis on that, or the ways in which we choose to interact with other people in the movement can often be ableist and can often exclude people who don't have as much access to that. Okay, I talked about this already. Ideological thoughts about gender essentialism at odds with views about the arbitrariness of gender. Gender is arbitrary, great, but for trans people, their gender is often seen as something that's inherent to them, that has been inherent since they were born. So how do you reconcile those two? Not clear. Okay, social norms regarding marriage and relationships. So this is an example of that last thing I identified, in which one group is governed by the same system as another. A lot of, and even in debates about monogamy, a lot of this kind of stuff can be applied, I think. And that kind of debate has been very trendy of late. So monogamy, one of the justifications for that is essentially a biological one, in which you identify that some people have penises, some people have vaginas, and you say there's a complementarity there where the two of them are designed to fit or work together. Because they're designed to fit or work together, there is something natural about that. Natural equals good. And the thing that is natural is a pairing, and particularly a pairing in which people are of mixed genders, right? So breaking down the idea of marriage, single person pairings, is good for people who are not monogamous or who do feel multiple, like affection for multiple people at once. But also, breaking down the idea of marriage as a whole is useful for allowing queer individuals, so gay men that marry each other or gay women that marry each other, also don't fit this complementarity, but they now get access to marriage. But also, the more you break down the idea that there is some idealized notion of what a couple should look like, or that should be tied to biology, or things that are natural, the easier it becomes for society to accept interracial relationships as well. So those things are connected to each other with varying levels of kind of directness. So I think it's most directly connected to those who are polyamorous, and then to people who are LGBT. But then also there are connections to things like the acceptance of interracial relationships, because they also don't conform to our social idea or our social ideals about what relationships ought to look like. Okay, and the final set of examples. So deconstructing gender norms and roles contributes positively to breaking down gendered expectations of sexuality. So the very notion of masculinity, the association of masculinity with power, I talked about how that can be applied to a bunch of situations. Class hierarchies, like the mobility and the idea of inherent roles, also contributed towards liberating women from the home. So the more we said there isn't like a place in society that everyone has, but through the prism of class, the easier it became to say there isn't a role everyone in society has through the prism of gender. And that's one of the reasons why on the other side of the Iron Curtain was some of the more, some of the societies more quick to decouple discrimination within law, right? So under communism and communist regimes, there wasn't seen as much of a distinction between men and women and their roles within the house, at first anyway, or at least in theory, which later became re-cemented. And so there is a way in which you can relate these ideas. Respectability norms govern multiple interactions. So gender nonconformity, female assertiveness, outward expressions of queer sexuality, breaking down expectations of respectability, of saying you have to be respectable or professional in the workplace, or you have to be a role model when you're in politics, can help numerous groups because there are a number of things that are not seen as respectable. And the more that you have people that are being visibly non-professional in one way in the workplace, the easier it becomes because they've kind of opened the door to people who are non-respectable in another way. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to talk very briefly about the two specific questions that I was asked. So the first question that I was asked pertained to cultural appropriation, and it basically said, what is cultural appropriation and why is it bad? So I think that a lot of people misunderstand what cultural appropriation is. Essentially, cultural appropriation is when individuals are using an aspect of another culture in a way that is against its intent, and it is bad when the intent is one that is particularly important to someone's identity. So an example of this that you might have seen that I think people in general would agree is bad is blackface, in which people basically dress up like someone from another race and then usually play out a stereotypical version of that. So that is appropriation of race, in which the way someone looks is being taken by someone who is usually white, and it is bad because it plays into the stereotypes that they're facing. A lot of cultural appropriation does play into stereotypes, and frequently the response that we get is, but it's cultural appreciation, or where is the line drawn and how do we participate within other people's cultures? So I think there are two main things that is important to think about here. The first is power. So the fact that people across the developing world wear jeans is not necessarily cultural appropriation, because the power structures are overwhelmingly in favor of people from the West, and jeans are developed in the US and then sold across the world. So it's not necessarily a form of cultural appropriation, because a powerful group is imposing that participation onto others. Or the idea that we should all be expected to speak English to be seen as cultured, or some other European language, that isn't cultural appropriation by non-white people, that is the enactment of a power structure. When that power structure goes the other way, you might be closer to cultural appropriation, because often there isn't consent. So for example, if I invite someone around to my house and they eat food, or they have cooked food themselves, I wouldn't necessarily see that as cultural appropriation, because it's something that a minority group is sharing in. But if someone without my consent, or without being in a space where they were invited to do so, decides to just wear Indian clothes to dress up, and they're doing so in order to, like it's a costume party or something, that is more likely to be culturally appropriative, because a group hasn't consented or invited you to participate and share. But even the harms of that can be quite hard to relate. I think there are some harms into the ways in which we play up stereotypes. Think of anybody who's gone to a costume party wearing a sombrero as a Mexican, and then you realize that you're perpetuating the idea of Mexicans as wearing sombreros and having maracas and playing up these very outdated notions of what it is to be Mexicana or Mexicano. But it's at its most harmful when the thing that's being appropriated is hugely important. So Native American headdresses are often hugely religiously significant. I think that when people wear the bindi, that's something that can be quite distressing to other individuals for whom that is a religious action, and often it leads to a corruption of that. This is problematic not just because it implicitly cements a power hierarchy in which the preferences of the people whose culture is being appropriated is seen as less important than the desire of the person who's appropriating to go to a party and enjoy themselves or to feel trendy, but also in the ways in which it devalues or can often be literally against religious or social norms. Yeah.
How does this kind of play out with interactions between groups that have usually have no little oppressive interaction with each other? For example, an example that comes to mind is a rapper, an Indonesian rapper called Rich Chigga, who's emulating and sort of making comedy of making sort of character in hip hop and in rap,
right,
which is done by a white person would be pretty terrible. But because he's from a unique
yeah.
Identity, it's not typically seen as being associated with hip hop. It's sort of seen as okay.
So the question was basically, how do we deal with this when there are different social groups that maybe don't interact with each other that much, but are nonetheless potentially appropriating? And I think the question can be very murky because there's often a lot to unpack. So what's her name? Honey J? She was Honey G. Yes, sorry. So Honey G is a rapper that was on the X Factor recently, and she is a white rapper. And we also have people like Eminem, who are also white rappers, and people like Macklemore, who are white rappers. And the reaction has been very differential to Honey G versus other people, because Honey G, like Ali G before her, played up to stereotypes of what Black people are supposed to be, and that inspires much more criticism. So it can partly be the specific manifestation of that, because rap exists now in a number of language and consequently racial contexts. So for example, there is Indian rap, there is K-pop rap, there is J-pop rap, there is rap throughout Africa, even though rap itself was perfected in, formed in the United States. Those interactions can be somewhat individual in terms of whether you think they're positive or negative. I think a lot of people would still say that rap in general is a form of appropriation that is somewhat negative, but it depends specifically on what's being rapped about and how it's being rapped about. Because also you have to remember that rap can sometimes be an important way for people to express their dissatisfaction with social structures and the status quo. And those can be true regardless of whether you're living in Compton, LA or in Jakarta. And so it can be important to still have that avenue to be able to do that. So there's no correct answer, obviously, and it's a debate. I think that's cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation, least important of the cultural appropriation debates. The two more important ones to me are what happens when you have different groups that have a reasonable claim towards cultural appropriation. So you just identified one in which this action is both something that is African American, but also can be a way to profit in a predominantly white industry or to comment on society when you face class disadvantage, and that doesn't necessarily seem to be harming African Americans that much. I think the other type of, so another manifestation of this might be when African Americans adopt a Pan-African identity. So African Americans adopting a Pan-African identity is seen by a huge number of people as very important because, you know, you don't even know where you came from due to slavery. And it can be great to adopt something that builds solidarity and is useful for things like civil rights movements. But at the same time, for a number of people within Africa, that's seen as homogenizing and erasing of the huge number of cultures that exist within Africa. And there are African commentators who oppose stuff like that. And there's no clear answer on this because both groups have kind of very credible rights to this behavior, but it seems like there might be some sort of trade-off between the two. I think the third type of question, which is really interesting in appropriation debates, is whether it is justifiable to profit off your appropriation. So, for example, suppose that I were to start a stall in which I let people, like, you know, I gave people bindis and I did mainly designs on their hands, and I myself am benefiting, and it is my culture, but most of the people that I'm giving it to are white because we're in Edinburgh. Is that acceptable or not? This ties into a lot of other debates about whether you have a responsibility to limit your own behavior for the good of other members of your group, or whether you should individually be allowed to benefit from something that normally disadvantages you. A way that this has been set in debates in the past is on whether tourist agencies should promote indigenous culture or use stereotypically indigenous images in their tourism promotions, or advertise tourism to indigenous areas. So for example, in Australia, using imagery like Uluru, which is a sacred place in a lot of indigenous Australian culture, or symbols like the boomerang, or ideas like Dreamtime in their messaging. Well, that's a very stereotypical idea of what it means to be indigenous, but also that does tend to lead to more people visiting indigenous populations, benefits them financially because they're getting more accustomed, and also might lead to more awareness of issues. So that trade-off is, I think, one in which there are arguments on both sides. It's interesting to debate. The other question that I was asked about was a motion that was set at the Trinity IB in 2016, and it asked whether deaf parents ought to be allowed to refuse treatment for their deaf children. So essentially, it pertains to whether you had some sort of right to impose a set of experiences on your child, and in particular, the aspect of this that was being used, the lens or the vector, was disability or different ableness. The question I was asked specifically pertained to proposition arguments, but I'm basically going to just summarize what I think the trade-offs within that debate or the way in that debate might be. So the first thing you have to establish is to what extent your level of ability is a social identity as opposed to a temporary experience, especially because the motion presumes that in this case, deafness can be cured. So it is not necessarily something that is inherent. That is similar to a lot of debates about religion, because obviously religion is not necessarily inherent to you. People convert into and out of religions. They fall to different religions or out of religion altogether. But it's still something that can feel incredibly inherent to you, particularly if you do buy into a religious framework of thinking. And the same can apply to ableness, in that it is, in this case, not necessarily something which is inherent to the child, but it is something that presumably is inherent to the parents, or the parents have chosen not to receive treatment for, that has formed a huge part of their identity. It is likely that this would also have formed a huge part of their interactions with society and the way that their household works. And so bringing a child in, we can understand why they might want the child to be like that. So the next question becomes whether it is inherently immoral to leave a child deaf if they can be treated and have a non-deaf experience. I think that these are the trickiest arguments to make, because most debaters have absolutely no understanding of deafness. And I think it can be quite callous, and essentially we would just be guessing if we were making arguments about whether that was a better life or a worse life. And frankly, I would not make that argument because I have no way of explaining whether that is true or not. And I don't think that there is an easy way to explain that. In debating, I think it makes much more sense to talk about the rights parents have over their children to govern their child's experience. So in a ton of other ways, we are already perfectly permissible with parents restricting what their children can do. So a parent can choose to bring up their child in a religion, even though in theory they could bring up their child irreligiously. Or a parent might choose to send their child to a certain school based on the people they've been socialized with. or a parent might choose to read certain things to their child, to give them certain ideas as they're being brought up. Parents choose to raise their children with genders or without genders. And so in a whole bunch of ways, parents already have some sort of control over the social characteristics that their children have. I think from proposition then, you would argue that it's not clear that this is a hugely different form of parental influence on the child. And then additionally, it seems as though if this is a curable or treatable deafness, maybe the child would have the ability to consent out of that in the future. And even if they didn't, then it's still not clear that this is such an overreach, given that the parents presumably operate within a framework in which they are happy enough being deaf. They don't feel like it's so significantly disadvantages them that they somehow want to save their child from that. And I think the second set of arguments you'd make there would be about the ways in which parents interact with their children and how having similar characteristics can be beneficial or harmful to family interactions. Also quite similar to debates about interracial adoption or adoption from the developing world to the developed world. From opposition, you argue kind of the opposite of both of the things that I've said, in which essentially you would want parents to be as non-restrictive as possible. And then obviously that presumes that deafness is a restriction rather than not a restriction. The way that you would justify that wouldn't necessarily be by arguing it is worse to be deaf than not to be deaf, because again, most people arguing this would have no idea. It is instead by saying society would view you as being disadvantaged, ascribe certain characteristics to you. Many parts of society are not deaf-friendly, and so you would find yourself materially excluded from participation in certain spaces. And then likewise, you go one step further and then say, and then the outcomes of this are likely to be higher because you then have some form of interaction in which children are likely to understand both aspects of their world rather than only ever living within a deaf world rather than a hearing world or a hearing world. Again, there are a bunch of different ways in which you can evaluate this debate. I think that that is just one of the ways I would prop and up this. Okay, so before I move on to general social oppressions, does anyone have any questions? Great, okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about is fragility. Does anyone know what fragility is? Okay, what does it mean for something to be fragile? A glass vase is fragile. What does that mean? It breaks easily. Okay. A Kit Kat breaks easily. Is a Kit Kat fragile? Yes. Okay. A chewy flapjack breaks easily. Is a flapjack fragile? Really? How often do you say what a fragile flapjack?
I remember that stuff on tables.
Okay. Well, so fragility is not just that something can break easily, it's that it seems strong until it breaks, right? So a vase or glass seems strong until you break it because glass is fragile. But something like rubber, we don't say rubber is fragile, even though you can break a rubber, because a rubber does not seem particularly strong. It bends and it changes and it's malleable. Fragility in this sense, or social fragility, is essentially the same thing. So Robin DiAngelo is one of my favorite theorists ever. And Robin DiAngelo is a great example of reading, if you want to do further reading about fragility theory. Essentially what it says is that if you have a majority trait, you don't see yourself as having that trait at all. Okay, so men very rarely think about their gender. They're never reminded of their gender. They're not particularly disadvantaged by their gender. They don't think they have one. If you're in a racial majority, you don't think about your race, right? You don't constantly see yourself as a minority. You're not thinking, what are other individuals thinking of me when they see me walking down the street because I'm, because I'm non-white, etc. So you don't see yourself as having a race. Straight people don't see themselves as having a sexual preference, and so on and so on. Because they see themselves as not having this characteristic at all, or as a default, and because people also suffer from solipsism, so solipsism here is a philosophical term, but essentially it means that you put yourself as the center of your own world, right? So your own experiences are more important to your thinking than other people's experiences. Your own preferences are seen as what other people must also somehow want. They then project onto others their own experiences, essentially, right? So you don't see yourself as having a race. A lot of people assume that no one else cares about their race either, because you don't, so why would they? And often when people dismiss an issue, so they say, oh, why are these women complaining about their periods or whatever? Well, it's because men never think about their biology in the same way women are forced to think about their biology by the fact that they have periods and by the fact that they have to pay for tampons, which are also really taxed, right? So this dismissal comes from solipsism, in which they say, what's the big deal? And then people who benefit from the system don't like to see themselves as having benefited. And how could they, when they don't see themselves as having a race at all? If you don't have a race, it cannot follow that you're benefiting from your race, right? So when formal oppression, informal oppression, and problematic constructs are ingrained, which is the discussion I gave you earlier as to how those things become ingrained, because you disproportionately play up the stereotypical examples that you see. You then view that as legitimizing what all of society has told you since you were born as being the normal way the world works. Because they're ingrained, they become so inherent in default, they don't see themselves as having benefited, okay? So this is fragile. It seems strong. Your sense of self is strong until it isn't. So when is it not? When there's a challenge to that perception, okay? And so when someone says there is white privilege, when someone says white police officers disproportionately target Black African-American citizens and view them as criminals, that is viewed as a challenge to oneself, because the notion of whiteness, and particularly if the notion of whiteness has meant you never had to be critical of the police, is also seen as a challenge towards your own privilege and your own benefit. So your fragile sense of self is under attack. Now, because it is so strong, you want to respond defensively to protect your self-conception. So this is where backlash comes from. People say, this causes backlash all the time. They never explain why there is backlash. This backlash comes from the fact that people don't see themselves as having benefited from social norms. They want to protect that conception of themselves as being non-beneficiary. Why? Because being beneficiary means that you are complicit in other people's non-benefit. And if you're complicit in other people's non-benefit, you might have some guilt. It is much harder to bend your social conception of yourself into one in which you take that guilt on than it is to essentially reject the claim that you should take on some guilt and say that the other individuals are wrong. So people, essentially acting in a selfish way here, end up lashing out towards other individuals. And they also serve to reinforce or justify social structures as a form of rationalization. So you never had to think about your race before and the fact that you benefited from your race. Someone says you have benefited from your race. This is a challenge to your idea that you are a good person who has not done anything wrong. First thing you do is you say, you are totally wrong. I can't believe you tear down a woman, another woman like this, right? That's the Taylor Swift example we talked about earlier. But the other thing you do is, because you fear it might be true that you have benefited from your race and that you are therefore somewhat complicit in the fact other people don't, you then rationalize it another way. You say, no, I just worked hard to get here. And because I worked hard, that's why I have more power or privilege compared to other individuals. And so, at the end of all of this, you've defended your fragile sense of self because it is so weak you don't want it to shatter, and as a way of deflecting all of the criticism you're receiving. And this is what leads to a bunch of self-centering of discussions, slaving, and then literally pretty much anything Taylor Swift has ever done when racist discussions. Literally anything. Right? The most recent example of this is a blogger of all people pointed out that Taylor Swift's music was being used by the alt-right, and essentially far-right white supremacists were building Taylor Swift up as an idol. And then they said, I think Taylor Swift should just verbally take a stand in which says, no, I'm not pro-white supremacy. It was literally easier for Taylor Swift to secretly send a cease and desist letter and threaten legal action against the blogger, despite the fact that she's one of the most powerful people in the entire music industry, than to just say, I'm anti-white supremacy, don't be white supremacists, right? Because even that tiny admission of complicity in guilt was seen as too much for her, and her response was actually a fragile one. So Taylor Swift is a really good example for a bunch of these behaviors, but actually a ton of people are. Anytime Donald Trump says, I'm not racist, you'll never get anybody more anti-racist than me, he's protecting his own fragile self. Yeah.
So when you think about this in terms of being fragile, what's fragile is the sense that they have no identity, they don't associate themselves as being.
Exactly. Okay. So I'll actually get onto this within the next section, which is about privilege. But basically, any time that you've ever found yourself saying, or ever seen other people saying, no, I can't possibly be racist, or I can't possibly be sexist, that is a fragile conception, right? We are all sexist and racist. I am literally sexist because I just exist as a man, and I benefit from systems that women don't benefit from, and I don't call them out all of the time and try to unpick them, and I happily take the fact that people take me more seriously, or pay more attention when I listen, or shut up when I interject in the conversation, right? I contribute to sexism, and the fact that I do that makes me sexist, but almost by default. But a lot of people don't like seeing themselves as doing that, and so that's fine. Incidentally, this also applies to one's friends. So, someone is accused of like embezzlement, sexual harassment. They say, oh, no, my friend would never do that. Oh, he's a good guy. Or, oh, he didn't mean it. Or, oh, he's just like that. Those are also ways in which people are demonstrating fragility. Yeah.
Is this necessarily where the sort of the really dangerous sort of like counter, where like backlash gets really bad, and like you start not just defending your fragility, but like taking pride in characteristics. Is that
Exactly.
necessarily where this comes from?
So it's not necessarily where it comes from, but I think this is where most of it comes from. And as far as debating goes, you're not always trying to find the one true universal system that causes results. Often there are multiple potential causes and we don't know, or there are multiple causes of which this is a very common one. So either way, it's good to know about this. Yeah, so the ultimate manifestation of all this fragility, this rationalization, the strongest form of rationalization isn't just, no, I don't benefit, I just worked hard. It's, I'm a victim too, right? You say, no, I grew up so poor, you don't understand. And then you flip it around to make them the aggressor and you're the one who's being victimized. So that's a way in which a lot of that language emerges. And that's what motivates action. The reason why white supremacists are trying to take their country back is because they literally rationalize criticisms of immigration policy and criticisms of structural racism as being not only untrue, but being oppositely true, in which they themselves were being victimized by racism. And then that's the way that they eventually spread it out. So I think a lot of backlash can be explained in some way as being related to this. Okay, so privilege. What is privilege?
It is not necessarily being like well off or like explicitly beneficial, like having explicitly like benefited, but it is being part of a subset of society that is like has generally benefited from like disadvantaged people.
Yeah, perfect. In really simple terms, privilege is oppression without intent. Yeah, you don't intend to benefit, you don't consent into being white or male or straight, but you do, and then you take those benefits and other people don't get them. How many of you have heard of Peggy McIntosh at all? Peggy McIntosh is great. So she is a white woman, she's a social theorist, an intersectional social theorist. She wrote this essay, and there is like this one section of the essay in which she lists like 46 ways she identifies that she benefits from her privilege, which includes such things as, I can talk to people about this without feeling like I'm somehow like hysterically advocating for my race, all the way down to, I can buy a plaster and know the plaster will look like my skin color, as opposed to someone who's black, who doesn't. I didn't realize for ages plasters were meant to be skin colored. I honestly just thought that's the color the material is. It's not. It's supposed to look like flesh. It just never looked like my flesh. I even have a plaster on my arm right now. You can see how white it is. For white people, plaster was supposed to be discreet. And do you know when I learned this? I learned this in food tech when we were cooking, and we were told to use glue plasters because otherwise you might not see that there is a plaster and it might get in the food. And I was like, but obviously you'd see that there's a plaster. And then I realized that white people don't see that their plasters are there because they're supposed to blend in. And anyway, point is, that's a form of privilege, right? That you're accommodated to by plaster manufacturers or makeup brands, right? Like you struggle to find makeup that suits you. So yeah, that's a form of privilege. And my personal pet peeve is when people like use a dictionary definition. Because if you go to any dictionary, which usually tend to be written by people who benefit from racism or sexism, they will define racism and sexism as being individual actions or discriminations. Actually, they're much more accurately described as systems. And privilege is a system of racism or a system of sexism or a system of homophobia in which people benefit. And so the fact that people don't give things thought, like the wheelchair example I used earlier, is an example of the privilege we have of not needing to think about those things. And there are numerous advantages that people enjoy or don't enjoy. And also, essentially, disadvantages they're not facing. Now, if you remember, when I gave you the recipe for oppression earlier, I talked about initial disparity spiraling into codified social discrimination. Privilege is a way in which initial disparities start forming. So each of these things might individually seem quite minute, but over time, what they do is they add up to contribute to a much larger gap. So individually, it might be the case that you're less likely to have makeup that suits the way that you look, or hairstylists that are proficient in dealing with Afro-textured hair, or plasters that look like your skin color, or clothes that are designed to fit a bustier body type. Each of those things individually might have only a small contribution to privilege for non-African American models. But what happens is you add them all up, and African American models are systemically less likely to be suited to beauty norms, less likely to be visible, which if you add up, inculcates a beauty norm in which Black people aren't what we think of when we think of beauty, which means subconsciously, not even actively, but subconsciously, we pick Black models less, which if you add up, contributes to a situation in which Black women are almost invisible in beauty and advertising, which if you add up, contributes to a lot of the body issues that people of color do face. the race anxiety that people of color do face, the fact that they do find themselves resorting to things like fair and lovely Queen in India. Okay, so it's interesting because privilege is individually often very small, but there are so many micro privileges that in total they add up to a medium or noticeable disparity. And then for the reasons we discussed earlier, those smaller disparities balloon into huge disparities that eventually have tangible harm. So if you find yourself asking, well, what's the harm of this in the debate? It's almost always that, because you've correctly identified a small disadvantage, but it's most useful to you to try and help it become something more tangible. Okay, so the next implication of fragility and privilege together is that the way social movements organize can change. So even within social movements, people are fragile and they have privileges, which means that they tend to exclude the voices of those who are disprivileged. So this is where white feminism comes from. White feminism is essentially fragility plus privilege in feminism. And it basically says white women's issues or the voices of prominent white women are over-exaggerated compared to the voices of non-white women. And as a result of that, the viewpoints that they have aren't going to be taken into account. We don't necessarily have campaigning for issues that are that important for them. And then this ends up changing that, right? So employers facing high numbers of, oh, this is a great example. This is one of the oldest examples of the intersection thing that we're talking about. So a ton of employers and a ton of universities have affirmative action policies because they identify that they get fewer non-white applicants. They also recognize, in a lot of cases, fewer women apply for promotions or they get fewer women applying for jobs. But because they consider them in separation, and in each case, there are intersectional systems of fragility and privilege, where within non-white movements, men tend to have more power, and within the feminist movement, white people tend to have more power. What happens is, one affirmative action system ends up benefiting women, but white women, and the other affirmative action system, which is supposed to be for people of color, ends up benefiting disproportionately men. And so what happens is, women of color fall through the cracks. And there are a ton of studies done about universities that try to increase the attendance of women into, like, for example, engineering, and they just found that this happened. They would have separate affirmative action movements. They think, okay, so we've got one for race, we've got one for gender, job done. And actually what they found was that disproportionately, subconscious biases were playing out within each, and then women of color fell through the cracks. And so this is because fragility and privilege exist. Privilege is the reason that this happened. Fragility is the reason it wasn't questioned for so long. Okay, and then respectability. This is the third one, and I think this one is quite important. So all social norms are forms of policing, right? Anytime we have a social norm, we're trying to control people's behavior. Right the way down to, like, general politeness, in which we are expected to say please and thank you. That is a form of social policing to try and reduce aggression. Or, you know, social norms in terms of queuing, well, that's a form of social organization in order to try and reduce like conflict when we're trying to allocate resources. All social norms are a form of policing. Doesn't mean that they're bad. But respectability is often very negative. Why? Because we conduct language and we come up with very coded ways of talking about people that limit the expression of disadvantaged groups and makes it harder to express challenges to oppression, right? So, clear example of this, first example of this, if you've ever been in an argument with your parents, or anybody, but for me it was always my parents, and they say something like, well, I'm not going to pay attention to you until you stop shouting, that is a respectability norm in which you're telling people that what they need to do is use a less forceful form of interaction with you before they will even be considered. The problem with that is that when you do that, you then have to try and minimize the impact of hurt that you are feeling or oppression that you are feeling, and that makes it easier for people who already have power to continue to cement that power, right? So anyone who says that protest needs to be incredibly peaceful and polite, well, that's actually a form of making sure that people don't express huge amounts of anger and actually pose a threat to individuals that are benefiting from power. But also, it places greater burdens on people in the way you have to behave, right? So when women have to wear high heels in the workplace that make them feel uncomfortable, and they have to wear makeup and constantly look beautiful in order to be taken seriously, they have far more hoops to jump through in order to achieve the same level of attention or the same level of respect as men are able to benefit from. The fact that you have to be hyper polite. So a lot of African Americans talk about teaching their children how to interact with the police, to make sure that they're very polite when police officers pull them over. They would say things like, how can I help you, officer? Would you like to see my identification? In order to make sure that they don't fall foul of this respectability. Because the respectability towards white people and non-white people are applied hypocritically, and any form of aggression or expressing discontent is seen as non-respectable. The same is like when women are told to smile. So women are always expected to perform happiness for men, and if they're not smiling, men get angry and say, oh, are you okay? Are you happy? Why aren't you smiling? And that's a form of harassment that women face a lot. But actually, it's because women are constantly expected to be joyous and give that joy to men, and it's not seen as respectable if they're not. It's seen as uncouth. It's seen as, churlish. And for women in particular, the list of social norms that they have to navigate is pretty much non-ending, because they also cannot be seen as too meek, because otherwise they're seen as not contributing enough into the workplace, etc. So there are a whole host of respectability norms that that need to play out, and it places an additional burden on people. So this is a form of social policing, because you cannot express that anger. It's harder for you to mobilize, and it's harder for you to retaliate against violence that you're facing, right? So a police officer can be beating you up, but the second you demonstrate any hostility back towards a police officer, you are a threat and they will shoot or arrest you. That is a respectability norm that the police officer does not have to face, but that you do have to face if you're a person of color in most Western countries. Okay, respectability 3. So the intersectional implications of this are that minority groups get alienated when they try to bring their issues up, right? So black women are often implicitly seen as having to wait for their turn to have their issue heard, because if they call out white women or the priority of the movement, they're seen as being hostile and talking women down. And white women often oppose forceful protests by black women against the police. And don't think that this isn't widespread. I mean, white women voted for Trump, but that's not necessarily something that was in the interest of black women. But black women who spoke out about it were told that they needed to stop being so forceful and allow white women to express their voices. And it also means that movements, particularly when they're led by people who conform to powerful groups, often try to achieve change within systems. So you're much more likely to say, oh, why don't we just send an email or go through the police or talk to the dean of the university or vote in a politician or stand for office? And that seems logical to you if you never have to benefit from disenfranchisement from those systems. If you're white or if you're male, you always get to benefit from that. So you're much more likely to say, why are we doing it this way? And that has the additional consequence of excluding minorities who either have insurmountable barriers to participation in that. So it's really difficult to just tell non-white women, why aren't you running for office? When if they ran for office, they would have every single aspect of their life scrutinized if they even got elected, and it's incredibly unlikely that they would get elected. But it's much easier for white women to say that, because the barriers for them, while they still exist, are considerably smaller. And particularly for rich white women, who have the resources to maybe overcome a lot of other disadvantages they might face. So this brings me on to structural oppression. Okay, so I realize I've been talking for a little while, so we're going to take a little bit of a break, and by break, I mean we're going to look at some pictures. So on the next slide, I want you to take a look at them and tell me what the pictures have in common. So just anything that you identify that is in common. Okay. Or if you're not sure what any of the pictures are, also feel free to raise your hand and talk about them. Does everyone know what these pictures are? Yeah, so on the top left, we have the Justice League. Over here, we have the Avengers. This is the popular 90s sitcom Friends. Over here, we have Game of Thrones. Down there, we have best-selling book of the decade, 50 Shades of Grey. And then this, does everyone know what this is? It's like a low-key obsession, Law and Order SVU. Okay, so what do these have in common? Okay, good. So the first thing is that these are hugely popular examples of their media. So this is probably as mainstream as you could get, right? Best-selling book, most watched TV show, biggest selling blockbuster, one of the most acclaimed and watched TV series of all time. Law and Order SVU has been running for 17 seasons. Okay, so this is the mainstream. What else is common about this? They are all white, or at least they're predominantly white. But the whiteness isn't the only thing that's here. They all have aspects of social interaction that is problematic. So in 50 Shades of Grey, this book, and a lot of books, most of the characters are white, or if they are not explicitly given a race, everyone assumes they are white when they are reading them, when they are adapting them, and when everyone tries to make a character non-white, there's a backlash against it. Game of Thrones, literally a show with more dragons than non-white people in it. Even though it takes place in a fantasy land, there's no justification for why all the characters ought to be white. And then up here, we have the Justice League and Marvel's Avengers. Both of those also have suffered from having a lot of white characters. Now they have introduced non-white characters that are prominent. So over here, we have Cyborg. In the Avengers, initially, there was Nick Fury, who was played by Samuel L. Jackson, and now they're introducing the Black Panther. But what they do suffer from is gender tokenism, in both circumstances, there's a single woman that is at all prominent, right? So in the case of the Justice League, it's Wonder Woman. In the case of Marvel's Avengers, it was, what's her name? Black Widow, yeah, sorry, Scarlett Johansson's character, Black Widow. Black Widow was supposed to get her own film, but it never manifested. I wonder why. Because of that. And Friends famously had a group of 20-somethings living in central New York, and this suffers from issues of both class and race. So they live in this huge apartment, completely ignoring the reality of what it is to be 20-something and living in New York. But also, it's ran for 10 seasons, and for most of those seasons, it didn't have any prominent non-white characters. Eventually, they introduced one that had a recurring role of any note, and she was a love interest to Ross Geller. But apart from that, there are very few black people. It faces a lot of criticism for that.
Also very
yeah, so actually, Friends is really interesting in terms of LGBT representation because it's been terrible by today's standards. And you watch it back and there are so many queerphobic jokes in it. But at the same time, right from the first season, they had an out and proud lesbian couple whose lesbianism wasn't viewed as a negative thing. It was often played for jokes, but they were frequently at Ross's expense. And that in and of itself is homophobic in some ways, but compared to the norm on television at that time, quite progressive in that respect. But apart from them, very few LGBT characters. Apparently Chandler was supposed to come out as gay by the third season, and then when the show really took off, they then rewrote the script so that he would fall in love with Monica. That also brings me to Law & Order SVU, 17 seasons, and there has been a single recurring LGBT character. A single one. And this is the type of show in which there's constantly a recycling of the main cast, because you can't have 17 years of the same actors, right? Like they grow old, or they move on, or they die. And so you cycle them out, you introduce new district attorneys, new recurring criminals, new recurring detectives, but it's been incredibly poor in that respect. Media narratives is one of the ways in which we talk a lot about social identity, and I think it's often discussed incredibly poorly. So what ends up happening when people discuss the media and the narratives that we see in society is they're maybe able to identify what they are, but then they aren't very good at identifying how it affects people or why we should care about it. But the first thing you need to know is that those portrayals in general are often skewed by tokenism and the presumption of whiteness or maleness or ableness as a default. So the character of Hermione Granger is quite a famous one because she is now being portrayed by a black woman in stage production, even though she's not explicitly raced very strongly within the books. We know she is, there's no reason for us to care that much that she is raced. Katniss Everdeen is explicitly mentioned as having olive skin in the Hunger Games books, but she's portrayed by the white actress Jennifer Lawrence in the films of the Hunger Games. Lavender Brown, does anyone know why she's on here?
I'm not sure this is quite is it a character in Harry Potter?
Yes, she's a Harry Potter character.
Was made black in the first film or one of the earlier ones when she was a minor character, and then because they didn't know she was getting a big part in the book later on, then when she rose to prominence as a major character, she was recast for white.
Exactly that. So Lavender Brown in the books is not given a race. In the films, she's a minor character because the films were started before the series of books had finished. By the Half-Blood Prince, which is the 6th book, it becomes apparent that she is going to be a major character, and she becomes a love interest for one of the 3 main characters, Ron Weasley. And then what happened is the actress who played her was replaced by a white actress. Now, there is an argument that says maybe the actress didn't want those roles or she wasn't suitable for a main role. But then the question is, why did you not find an actress who looks like her in order to replace her, which is what you would do if any white... In fact, what they did do with Dumbledore, when Dumbledore, Richard Harris, the initial Dumbledore, passed away, they then found another white actor to play Dumbledore, and then they didn't, race bend him. So that's a subconscious bias that played out there, because whiteness is seen as a default. And this assumes that there is any portrayal of minority groups, because there is often erasure of them. So we just don't discuss them. And even if we are discussing them, it's often because that identity is somehow central to their narrative. Yeah.
With examples like the casting of the character The Ancient in Doctor Strange, where it was especially a Asian man who was the character, and it was a white woman who was cast. It sort of seems like the fact that it was it's like because it was a woman that was like more important than the representation of race. So acknowledge some kind of like hierarchy of like issues that are more or less important.
Exactly, and again, the question that I would ask there, if I was being critical, was why not just get an East Asian woman, right? Like there are a ton of them out there that are incredibly huge in media industries around the world, because Hollywood is not the only film industry, so why would you not do that? But instead, there is this idea that there has to be some form of tokenism or erasure, and that the way that erasure plays out can be incredibly differential, but it almost always leads to the exclusion of certain groups. And so this is the suspect. Even if they are portrayed often an actor not from that group is portraying them, right? So think of the number of times in which a straight actor, usually one of the Franco brothers, plays a gay character. Or when able-bodied actors play disabled characters, like when Eddie Redmayne plays Stephen Hawking. Or in the worst circumstances, when white people are playing non-white characters as well. Although that tends to be rarer because backlash about blackface or other forms of race bending by individuals tends to be more prevalent in that. Okay, so the impact from this, or the ways in which we can talk about why this is important, here are 3 ones that I think are quite common. The first is just that there are more likely to be insensitive portrayals. If you don't have that lived experience, I can say this is how I actually feel, or I just don't think any woman would behave this way towards that man, etc. Also means that they're less likely to be on set talking to producers and able to, for example, shape the way that they are filmed or scripted, which then feeds through into the social biases we talked about earlier. The reduction of race, queerness, or ableness to a literal costume, often exploited for commercial or critical success. So this ends up playing into the idea that the way we think about social structures is that we can just, if we are in a position of privilege, borrow other people's identity to benefit ourselves. And so this isn't necessarily a harm, right? There's no like victim here, but the harm is actually the way in which society itself thinks of race or thinks of gender as not being something they have to be critical or respectful of. But I think the one in which it is clear that there's a victim is that you end up contributing to an inability for actors that are from that group to succeed in your industry, right? So if white people are taking roles intended for non-white actors, or if able-bodied or straight actors are taking roles intended for non-able-bodied or LGBT actors, it becomes much less likely that they have as many acting credits as them. They're less likely to be considered for future roles. Often, you get an award if you're straight and you play someone who's disabled, because it's seen as such a huge burden. But at the same time, that ends up further cementing the gap in which able-bodied actors or cis straight actors are rewarded, and then they become more desirable, they're more likely to command larger salaries, and so on and so forth. And then these are always backed up by pre-existing disparities in terms of length of contract. So for example, women characters are less likely to have strong contracts across multiple seasons on TV shows, or you get a lower salary if you're a woman. So Friends, again, is a really interesting example, is that they initially tried to pay the Friends differential salaries. So they wanted to pay Ross and Rachel's character, not Ross and Rachel, but Jennifer Aniston and David Schwimmer, the actors who play Ross and Rachel, the highest salaries, and then they wanted to pay everyone else lower salaries, and they wanted in general to pay the male characters slightly more than the women characters. And they eventually unionized and said, we will all quit the show unless you pay us all the same salary. And then by the end, they were paid equal salaries. So that was an example in which this gap was overcome, but the intention or the tendency of production companies tend to be to do this. The other thing that I don't talk about in this presentation, but I do think is important, is often when we're talking about media, the most visible form of that is actors themselves, but we ignore, or authors or musical artists, but we ignore who does most of that production, which are the production companies, the directors, the publishing agents, record producers, stuff like that. That is overwhelmingly white and male. Overwhelmingly white and male. It is so rare for there to be non-white directors, incredibly unheard of for there to be women directors. Black women directors are noteworthy in and of themselves, right? But they release films that are headlines about it. That's how rare it is. And so this ends up influencing a lot of those portrayals as well. I think at times we can fall into the gap of assuming actors have a lot of agency over how they have to act, not recognizing there's this whole system. But there is an interaction between them. Okay, so next on media narratives, as well as representation, so the characters and who plays them themselves, the types of stories they're in often fall into issues. So there's a hero-villain dichotomy or a victim-savior dichotomy, which tends to prioritize like good-looking white people as the heroes and other people as villains. Women tend to get roles in which they're not leads. They tend to be the romantic foil to men. If they are the lead, it tends to be a romantic comedy, so romance is the central aspect of them. And if they are getting the lead in action films, they're already at 3 levels of if. That is almost always justified by a woman on screen experiencing some form of prior trauma, right? So in Wonder Woman, she literally has to watch as several members of her community and her family get gunned down. In The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, there's a sexual assault at the start. In Kill Bill, she's literally buried alive. And this is often an incredibly strong form of violence against women, in which the violence of women is almost fetishized and then later used to justify the woman enacting violence against men. And it's all fetishistic. And it never happens to men that we witness men, or it very rarely happens to men, I should say, that we witness men being in cases where they're experiencing such deep emotional or violent trauma in order to justify them later becoming agents that have some form of control over their own interactions or can enact violence on others. And stereotypes are often reinforced. So poor people tend to be non-white, or they tend to be criminals, they're more likely to be thugs, so they deal drugs. Queer people are hypersexual, they have AIDS, they're very camp. All of those stereotypes are much more normal because deviating from the default is only reasonable if it is central to the character's existence, right? So you need a reason to do it for some reason. And then finally, we selectively tell certain historical stories at the expense of others. So it just means that our understanding as a society of the contributions of minority groups is much lower. This is the Stonewall example I talked about earlier, in which the contributions of Black and trans people were diminished at the expense of centering around a cis white man. Okay, so having talked about the media narratives, well, let's talk about law and justice. There's a lot of debate centered around changing laws or the ways in which they interact with the justice system. We like to think, or often are taught to believe, that laws are about what is good and what is right, and about protecting ourselves and protecting other people, but it's just as often the enforcement of power. So here's a non-exhaustive list of things that were or are legal. Okay, my clicker's not working. So here's a list of things that were or are legal. So race, we've got slavery, apartheid, segregation, anti-miscegenation laws, literal dehumanization, by the way. So do you know what the 3/5 compromise is? Yep.
There was a ruling that Black people in America would only count 3/5 of a person for the census count.
Yeah, it was a ruling that basically came about when they were writing constitutional amendments, and they basically said, as a compromise to convince states to give up slavery, they said we'll only count them as 3/5 of a person. The Australian referendum 1967. Does anyone know? Yep.
Whether Aboriginal Australians should even be considered people.
Yeah, so until 1967, there was no constitutional requirement to count Indigenous Australians as people for the purposes of censuses. This is often misrepresented as like they were classed as animals, which is not true because there was never a law that explicitly said that. But what is true is that often, because they weren't counted as people for the purposes of censuses, their affairs were managed by the same department that would handle national parks and animals. And so it was literally a way of dehumanizing them. And if you're not on a census, your issues are never taken into account. No one ever bothers to care about you as a potential voting bloc, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and then right at the end we have LGBT, so criminalization in some places by execution, medicalization, so the idea that being gay is a psychiatric condition. A lot of places still have this for people who are transgender or suffer from gender dysphoria, as gender transitioning, or prohibition of teaching in schools and sexual education. So the list can be quite large. It goes, goes on and on. So those are all things that were legal, and the reason for this is usually some interaction of who gets to write laws and what their individual lawmaking interest is. So what are they acting on behalf of? Very rarely is it all of society. Frequently it's rulers in their specific constituency, and within their constituency, who has the most votes. Almost always, for numerical reasons, if nothing else, a majority group. And what social context informs that lawmaking. So what things are acceptable or unacceptable for them to propose. So some examples of ways in which this plays out then cements disadvantage. Voter registration laws in the USA, so as they get stricter, they disproportionately affect people who are poorer or people who are from non-white communities, because they say you need an ID, but it's hard to get an ID if you can't drive to a DVLA because you don't have a driving license to begin with, or you're poor so you can't afford petrol, or you don't own a car, and that ends up impacting who can vote. So if you're less likely to have non-white votes, you're less likely to have people who can vote out politicians who are trying to cement their white base by then introducing stricter laws. Differential criminalization and sentencing, e.g. for cocaine. So crack cocaine is criminalized much more strongly than other forms of cocaine, even though there is very little medical justification for that. You go back to Nixon, one of the nice things about Nixon is that a ton of his stuff leaked, and he's very explicit about this, about going after the blacks, the gays, and people who are against the Vietnam War. So it's a form of criminalization that was introduced because crack cocaine was preferred by inner city communities which were disproportionately black. And so it became a way in which the incarceration of black men in particular became justifiable by law in a way that never happened for white people. And even when white people use drugs, like Justin Bieber openly brags about smoking weed, but if a black teenager did that, then obviously they'd be arrested very quickly. Bans on wearing face veils and outward minarets. This is the way in which Islamophobia often plays out, and those are cemented by laws. It makes it harder for people to openly express their identity, which means that they're less visible, which means people are less likely to take their interests into account. Opposition to equal marriage, the restriction of immigration rules, and gendered language in legislation. So do you guys know about the spousal veto? So the spousal veto is in place in England and Wales. Essentially what it says, and this was introduced at the same time as equal marriage legislation, so very recently, is that if you are in a marriage and you want to gender transition, so you want to legally change your gender, your partner has to give you permission before you are permitted to do that. And so the only way in which you can do it otherwise is by getting their permission for a divorce, going through divorce proceedings, which are hugely expensive, can take 3 or 4 years, and then applying for gender transition. So the spousal veto is a way in which language ends up, gendered language in legislation ends up influencing them. Okay, and provocation laws. So do you guys know about provocation laws? They're so horrifying. Basically, in many jurisdictions, if someone, so suppose that like Cynthia attacks me, the fact that Cynthia has attacked me is a justification for me to hurt her to protect myself, right? That's self-defense. It might also be the case that Cynthia and I are having an argument and she threatens me, so she has not actually tried to hurt me, but if that provokes me out of anger to kill her, that's a law of provocation, right? This plays out in a hugely gendered way though, because what ends up happening is that men who get into like bar fights are more likely to have their crime downgraded, but women who face abusive husbands who don't kill their husband immediately after that, but wait until they're sleeping, for example, don't get to benefit from provocation laws, and so they end up being criminalized to the full extent of the law, even though they're probably more a victim of abuse than just a man who gets in a bar fight. Or another example of this is stand your ground laws. So this is if you feel threatened, you're allowed to stand your ground and shoot somebody, which is used a lot against African Americans in the US. In Australia, acceptance of non-violent homosexual advance is also seen as a justification for stand your ground law. So there were a bunch of controversial cases in which individuals would try to shoot a guy that like made a pass at them or expressed homosexual interest in them, and they were saying they were just standing their ground because they felt threatened, and that was deemed legally acceptable. Yeah.
There's also some US states where you are based on family, where you find someone is transgender and you are therefore like.
Exactly. So those facts are clear. So the enforcement of the law is done through the police, mediated by justices, which is judges in courts, and moderated by juries. None of these look like the average social minority. And as a result of this, inbuilt biases come into play. Otherness is constructed about those people. And then legal instruments such as peremptory challenge, strikes before judge disqualification, basically when like prosecutors say, oh no, this jury is biased due to their race or their interactions with the police, excludes them, makes it harder for people to get true justice. So the consequences of this are things like selective policing of certain communities. Police brutality is more likely to be encouraged or condoned, and victim blaming and presumptions of women's guilt takes place within the courtroom, right? So women are constantly asked, like, you know, what were you wearing? Did you leave them on? Were you drunk, etc. Racial profiling and so on and so forth also plays out. So you might think, well, why don't people just fix this through democracy? Because a lot of the same problems go through democracy, right? So representation in most democracies is an issue for minorities, and everyone is pretty much underrepresented. Particularly if they exist at intersections, and this is because democracy to some extent naturally disfavors minorities. It's a majoritarian system of government. Finally, the expectations are for politicians to be moral role models, and so anyone who doesn't conform to our responsible or respectable norms is less likely to get elected. They're seen as being somehow a bad influence on individuals. Interest groups, particularly when voters have to pander to particular constituencies, often oppose pro-minority policies. This says anti-minority. It should be that often anti-minority or propose anti-minority policies. Oh, no, this is right. Minorities are also easy scapegoats for political point scoring. So you could like paint minorities as a threat and say, but they are coming to hurt you. And because they're a minority, it's easier to do that. And then this constructs participation in democracy, right? So natural born citizen clauses in which anyone from outside your state is a threat to your state or is treasonous means that it's often harder for them to achieve power. If you have to give up all of your other citizenships to become an MP, which is the law in Australia, for example, you get fewer people that have experiences representative of the numerous migrants that live within the Australian state. So the impact of this is big on most people, but in particular on minority groups who are often disproportionately reliant on the state. Not just because we identified the formal barriers we talked about earlier, but also because they're more likely to require state services. So for example, if you're poorer, you're more likely to require things like welfare. Things like healthcare and childcare, which is important for like trans individuals or for women, are things that you can't get individually, so you need a state to provide them for you. But also they're the most likely to get the votes of others because other people are voting on your issues, right? So everybody gets to vote on abortion, but only half the population will ever need it. Within groups, advocacy also tends to focus on the issues of the most privileged within that. So we kind of discussed that already. But that basically means that even when you do get provisions, the specific allocation of that, which school districts it goes to, which hospitals get funding, also tends to disfavor those minorities that exist at intersections. Okay, so we're just coming up to the end of our 2 hours. I'm not going to go through this because these are just common clashes in debates about social identity. Take these down or take a copy of this because everything that I've talked about earlier is what's just on the next few slides. There's nothing new on these next few slides. They're just common trade-offs that we have to be able to debate about. Okay. So top down or bottom up, that's do you start with problematic constructions or do you start with the formal barriers? And in which direction do you go? How do you try and advocate for social change? Do you do it within the system or outside the system? Should you harm yourself for your group or benefit yourself? You'll notice we talked about a lot of these, but these are the underlying trade-offs within a lot of common debates. Conditioning chicken and egg. Is it inherent to feel this way? Or have we just been told by society to feel this way? This house regrets monogamy, that's this, right? The born this way debate I talked about, that's this. Are we actually born this way? Or are we just told that our sexuality is an inherent part of who we are and we're inherently going to go burn it out? And that kind of feeds into the idea that it's inherent to us. Other common clashes. Should we include X group in the movement? Well, that's a debate about whether those interests can ever be reconciled or ought to be reconciled. Should, as Y group, we leave the movement? That's about whether this group is ever going to accommodate your interests. So womanism is a phrase coined by Alice Walker, who said womanism is to feminism as purple is to lavender. Essentially, it's a centering of the interests of non-white women relative to white women. So you can think of it as being equivalent to black feminism or similar to black feminism. And a ton of wominists say that we are a type of feminism, but a lot of others advocate breaking away from mainstream feminism because they feel like mainstream or mixed feminist spaces will never accommodate womanists or black women's interests. The next one, campaign with this policy or ideology. So this is stuff like that feminists should, for example, be against sex positivity in the media. That's basically, again, about whether the ideology or if individual policy itself benefits all members of that group or does not benefit members of that group. And extensions of this are frequently to do with how much this challenges people's fragility and whether the challenge is strong enough to provoke a greater backlash and a greater restriction of women's abilities to achieve change or the group's ability to achieve change than the benefit of that ideology in the first place. This has regrets or supports or opposes and there's some social norms. We see these all the time. This is about the broader social structure itself. So when I talked about broad social structures that have multiple different forms of oppression underneath them, that's this, okay? Are the benefits of that social structure worth the often multiple groups that are affected in some way by that way of thinking? And then radical versus liberal. This is the thing that I've kept talking about for the last 3 hours. Essentially, to what extent should we be prescriptivist about people's behaviors, or to what extent should we celebrate individualism and individual success within the group? Okay, and then just finally, some tips to bear in mind. So obviously, all of these debates have different elements to them, and I can't cover all of them. So sometimes you have to talk about like the state has responsibilities towards these people, or we have responsibilities towards other individuals. That takes a lot of time to cover in depth, and I can't do all of that, but definitely do more reading and thinking about how you might make those arguments in order to really tie all of this together. So the next thing that I just want you guys to bear in mind is that everyone's experiences are not going to be homogeneous, and so where possible, try and be as nuanced as possible in your debating. That specificity ends up adding clarity to what you are saying, but it also helps you to make arguments that aren't just repetitions of other people's arguments. And then finally, frame debates along lines of moral relevance. So to whom does the state owe a responsibility? I think people often say we should care the most about them because they're the most vulnerable. That is the laziest level of this analysis, right? Why should we care the most about the most vulnerable? I think that good answers to this question often have like analytical underpinnings that start with your ability to consent into the way that you are and the way that you have previously been treated by the state or the system, right? Because then it's much easier to say you have responsibility. Like if I were to slap one of you, I would have a specific responsibility to apologize and try and make you hurt less, as opposed to somebody else who just witnessed that happening, right? So that's one way you might make this argument. Next, don't just talk about material outcomes. That is important, but remember to talk about the systems as well, the perceptions, the viewpoints, the power values, and social organizations and hierarchies that exist. Because that feeds through into material outcomes as well, and not necessarily just for the group that you've identified initially. So I can make your arguments more wide-ranging, and then where possible, avoid assertions and generalizations, so try and be as particular as you can about your language, but basically don't shy away from analysis about minority groups. It isn't something you have to be ashamed of, it's not tokenism, but it is important that if you're going to do it, you do it properly. You try and do it right, and you try and explain why this is important. If you're struggling with that, often something that is small or seems small grows into something much larger, and then it's much easier for you to argue why that's important. So the first few slides, the generalized recipe for oppression, is a good way, or at least I found that to be a good way of explaining why small disparities eventually turn into larger disparities, which eventually cement themselves as state structures, and how those state structures then feed through again into individual people's experiences. It's circular. Okay. So last thing I'm going to do, while I open up the floor to any remaining questions, is basically to implore you to look once again at the sheet of paper that you made at the start, with a social group you feel comfortable talking about and one that you feel uncomfortable talking about. For the one that you feel comfortable talking about, I want you, if you want, obviously you don't have to talk about write down the formal barriers, informal barriers, and problematic constructions in the way that we discussed. Then think about different manifestations and issues of that. I should have given you a few examples that you might be able to use. And then I want you to try to do the same thing for the other social group. Now, if you find yourself struggling to think of examples, that is what you need to try and do more reading and research on, right? That's exactly what the point of this exercise is to show you that intersectionality means there are often relationships between different social movements, and they're often similarly affected by the same systems, but also they do have uniquenesses to them. You can't just lazily assume one is like the other. So the conclusion of all of this is, if you find yourself drawing the blank for some parts of one ideology, or one social group, or one political perspective of a social movement, that's okay. You can probably get hints from things you do know about, but then just make sure that you are trying to be as specific as possible about that. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you everyone who's been watching at home. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, cool. So I think I'll call it a night there. Cheers, everyone. Thanks. Okay. And if you have any questions at home, feel free to contact me via the Scottish EUDC training program, and or leave a comment on this post, and I'll do my best to get back to you. All right. Bye, everyone.